public spectacle, and social control. Here's something that might shock you. Most of these tortures weren't done in secret. They were public events, like some twisted form of entertainment. Medieval people would gather in town squares to watch executions and torture sessions like we might go to a football game today. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about sending a message. When people saw what happened to criminals, heretics, or political enemies, they got the message loud and clear about what would happen if they stepped out of line. One of the most documented public torture spectacles took place in London in 1305, when William Wallace, yes, the Scottish hero from Braveheart, was executed. But the movie doesn't show you the full horror of what actually happened. Wallace was first dragged through the streets tied to a horse, then hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled while still alive, then beheaded and quartered. Thousands of Londoners came out to watch, and contemporary accounts describe the crowd cheering at each stage of the torture. The execution of Robert-François Damiens in 1757 in Paris became legendary for how horrific and public it was. Damiens had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV with a small knife that barely scratched the king. His punishment was deliberately designed to be the most brutal possible. He was tortured with red-hot pincers, had molten lead poured into his wounds, and then 4 horses were used to tear his body apart. But here's the really disturbing part. The torture took so long that the crowd, which had initially come for entertainment, gradually became horrified and started demanding that the executioners end his suffering. It took over 4 hours for Damiens to die, and witnesses reported that he was still conscious and speaking even after his limbs had been torn off. The event was so brutal that it actually helped turn French public opinion against torture. The Spanish Inquisition turned public torture into a theatrical production called the auto da fe, which literally means act of faith. These weren't just executions, they were elaborate ceremonies that could last for days. The largest auto da fe took place in Madrid in 1680, where over 100 people were tortured and executed in front of the royal family and thousands of spectators. The victims were paraded through the streets wearing sanbenitos, special tunics that marked them as heretics. Those who were to be tortured had flames painted on their clothing pointing upward, while those who would be executed had flames pointing downward. The crowd was encouraged to throw rocks and garbage at the condemned as they passed. What's particularly disturbing is that these events were considered family entertainment. Parents brought their children to watch, believing it would teach them moral lessons about the consequences of sin and disobedience. Church records from Seville describe how school children were given the day off to attend auto da fe ceremonies as part of their religious education. The public nature of torture also served another purpose. It allowed the community to participate in the justice process. In many German cities, torture sessions were held in public squares, and citizens were encouraged to call out questions they wanted the torturers to ask the victim. This crowd participation made torture feel democratic and legitimate. In England, public torture sessions at Tyburn, where London's Marble Arch now stands, became so popular that bleacher seats were erected for paying customers. The wealthy could purchase prime viewing spots, while common people crowded around for free. Vendors sold food and drinks, and pickpockets worked the crowds. It was literally a carnival atmosphere built around human suffering. One particularly horrific example of community participation in torture occurred during the peasant revolts in Germany in 1525. When rebel leaders were captured, entire villages were invited to participate in their torture. In one documented case in Würzburg, a peasant leader named Florian Geyer was tortured over the course of 3 days, with different villagers taking turns operating the devices. The community participation was seen as a way of collectively rejecting the rebellion and reaffirming loyalty to their lords. Torture was also used as a form of social control against marginalized groups, and these sessions were often the most public and brutal. During times of plague or famine, scapegoats were needed, and torture provided a way for communities to channel their fear and anger. The persecution of Jewish communities during the Black Death provides numerous examples of how public torture served social control functions. In Cologne in 1349, the entire Jewish community, over 20,000 people, was arrested and tortured in public view. The torture sessions lasted for weeks, with different families being brought out each day for the entertainment of Christian crowds. What makes these events even more disturbing is how they were documented and celebrated. We have detailed accounts because people were proud of what they had done. City chroniclers recorded these tortures as great victories for Christianity and civic order. Artists created woodcuts and paintings depicting the torture of heretics and enemies of the faith. These weren't shameful secrets. They were public achievements that communities wanted to remember and celebrate. The social control aspect of public torture was particularly effective because it created a climate of terror that extended far beyond the actual victims. When people saw their neighbors, friends, or family members tortured in public, they got the message that anyone could be next. This fear kept entire populations in line and discouraged dissent or rebellion. Even the threat of public torture was often enough to maintain control. In many cities, torture devices were permanently displayed in public squares as reminders of what awaited those who broke the law. The gibbet, where executed criminals were hung in cages to rot, was specifically designed to keep the threat of torture visible to everyone who passed by. Perhaps most disturbing of all, these public torture sessions created a sense of community bonding among the spectators. Shared witnessing of extreme violence created a collective identity based on exclusion and fear. People who watched torture together felt connected to each other and separate from the victims, reinforcing social hierarchies and group boundaries that kept medieval society functioning according to the wishes of those in power. Medieval torture. The dark side of justice. Picture this. You wake up in a cold, damp dungeon somewhere in 13th century Europe. Iron bars surround you, chains hang from the walls, and strange metal devices sit in the shadows. You hear screams echoing from somewhere down the hall. Welcome to the terrifying world of medieval torture chambers. Today, we're diving deep into one of the darkest chapters in human history. In medieval Europe, torture wasn't just punishment. It was considered a legitimate way to extract truth, enforce justice, and maintain social order. But how did these horrific practices become so widespread? And why did they continue for centuries? Get ready. Because what you're about to hear will make you grateful you weren't born 1,000 years ago. The rise of medieval torture. So here's the thing about medieval Europe. It was a world where might made right, and human life was pretty cheap. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe was basically a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, each with their own laws and methods of keeping order. Now the Romans had used torture, sure, but they had some rules about it. In medieval times, those rules pretty much went out the window. By the 12th century, the Catholic Church was gaining massive power, and they brought with them the idea that physical suffering could purify the soul. This religious justification made torture not just acceptable, but almost holy in some people's minds. The really messed up part is that torture was seen as a scientific method of finding truth. Medieval people genuinely believed that an innocent person would be protected by God during torture, while the guilty would confess to end their suffering. This twisted logic formed the backbone of medieval justice systems across Europe. We can see this shift happening in real time through historical records. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull Ad Extirpanda, which officially authorized the use of torture by the Inquisition. This wasn't some underground practice. This was official church policy, signed and sealed by the Pope himself. The document specifically stated that torturers should not cut off limbs or cause death, but otherwise gave them pretty much free rein. One of the earliest documented cases under this new policy involved Peter of Verona, later St. Peter Martyr, who was investigating heretics in northern Italy around 1240. His methods were so brutal that even other church officials complained, but he was eventually canonized as a saint, literally made a saint for his torture work. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 had banned trial by ordeal, the old Germanic practice where people proved their innocence by surviving tests like holding hot iron or being thrown into water. Sounds barbaric, right? But here's the twisted part. The Church replaced these irrational ordeals with systematic torture, claiming it was more civilized and reliable. At least with trial by ordeal, you had a chance that God might save you. With medieval torture, the only way out was confession. The legal framework of pain. Let's talk about how this whole system worked, because it wasn't just random violence, it was organized, legal violence, which somehow makes it even worse. In most medieval courts, There were actually rules about when torture could be used. Sounds civilized, right? Wrong. These rules were basically a how-to guide for inflicting maximum pain while staying within the law. First, you needed what they called half-proof of guilt. This could be as simple as someone saying they saw you near the scene of a crime. Once you had half-proof, boom, torture was on the table. The idea was that torture would get you the other half of the proof through confession. But here's where it gets really twisted. If you confessed under torture, that confession had to be repeated freely after the torture ended. If you took back your confession once the pain stopped, guess what? Back to torture you went. This created an impossible situation where the only way to escape was to confess to something you might not have even done. The church developed something called the Inquisition, which turned torture into an art form. Inquisitors had detailed manuals explaining exactly how much pain to inflict, for how long, and using which methods. They even had rules about giving the tortured person breaks to consider their sins, as if they were doing them a favor. The torturer's toolkit, instruments of agony. Now we get to the really dark stuff, the actual tools used in medieval torture. And let me tell you, the people who designed these devices had seriously twisted imaginations. But these weren't just theoretical horrors. We have detailed historical records of exactly how they were used on real people. Let's start with one of the most famous, the rack. Picture a wooden frame with ropes attached to pulleys at each end. The victim would be tied to the rack by their wrists and ankles. Then the ropes would be slowly tightened, stretching their body until joints dislocated and bones broke. One of the most documented cases comes from the Tower of London in 1546, when Anne Askew, a Protestant reformer, was tortured on the rack. The Lord Chancellor and other officials actually operated the device themselves when the professional torturer refused to continue. Askew's shoulders and hips were dislocated so severely that she had to be carried to her execution in a chair because she couldn't walk. What makes her case particularly notable is that she never confessed, despite hours of torture. Then there was the Judas cradle, which is exactly as horrible as it sounds. It was a pyramid-shaped seat that victims were lowered onto, with the point positioned to cause maximum agony. In 1597, the Venetian Inquisition used this device on a man named Giordano Bruno, though he's better known for being burned at the stake for his scientific beliefs. Records show that victims of the Judas cradle could be kept alive for days, with torturers controlling the pressure by adjusting ropes and pulleys. Water torture was incredibly popular because it left no visible marks. The most common method involved forcing the victim to drink massive amounts of water through a funnel, causing their stomach to swell painfully. In 1568, during the Dutch Revolt, Spanish inquisitors used this technique on Willem van Oranje's supporters. One victim, a merchant named Jan de Bakker, reportedly had over 4 gallons of water forced down his throat before confessing to heresy. Survivors described the sensation as drowning while being unable to die. The strappado was another favorite, particularly in Italy. Victims had their hands tied behind their backs and were hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. The sudden drops and stops would dislocate shoulders and often break arms. Niccolò Machiavelli himself was subjected to the strappado in 1513 when accused of conspiracy against the Medici family. He later wrote about the experience, describing how the pain was so intense that he would have confessed to anything just to make it stop. One of the most horrific devices was the pear of anguish, a metal device shaped like a pear that was inserted into the victim's mouth, rectum, or vagina, and then slowly expanded using a screw mechanism. This device was specifically used on people accused of different types of crimes. The mouth for heretics and blasphemers, the rectum for homosexuals, and the vagina for women accused of adultery or witchcraft. Records from the Spanish Inquisition describe its use on Maria de Cazalla in 1532, accused of being a religious reformer. The breaking wheel was perhaps one of the most public and dramatic forms of torture. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel and beaten with hammers or iron bars until every major bone was broken. In 1757, Robert-François Damiens, who attempted to assassinate King Louis XV of France, was subjected to this torture in front of thousands of spectators in Paris. Contemporary accounts describe how it took hours for him to die, with the crowd becoming increasingly horrified as the torture continued. The Spanish boot, also known as the iron boot, was designed to slowly crush the leg. Wedges were hammered between the boot and the leg, gradually crushing bones and flesh. During the Scottish witch trials of 1590 to 1591, dozens of accused witches had their legs destroyed by this device. One victim, Gillis Duncan, reportedly had her leg bones so thoroughly crushed that fragments had to be picked out of the boot afterwards. Red-hot pincers were used to tear flesh from victims' bodies, often targeting sensitive areas like the breasts, genitals, or face. In 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was tortured with heated pincers before being burned at the stake. Witnesses described how pieces of his flesh were torn away while he maintained his innocence of the charges against him. Famous cases that shocked even medieval society. While torture was commonplace in medieval Europe, some cases were so extreme or involved such prominent figures that they became legendary, and not in a good way. Let's start with the case of Joan of Arc in 1431. Yeah, the French saint was actually tortured by the English before her execution. During her trial for heresy and witchcraft, Joan was threatened with torture, and shown the instruments that would be used on her. The transcript of her trial, which still exists today, records her response. "Truly, if you were to tear me limb from limb and separate my soul from my body, I would not tell you anything more." She was eventually executed without being physically tortured, but the psychological torture of the threat was considered sufficient by her captors. Even more shocking was the case of the Knights Templar between 1307 and 1314. King Philip IV of France, deeply in debt to the Templars, orchestrated their downfall through systematic torture. On Friday, October 13th, 1307. Yes, that's where the Friday the 13th superstition comes from. French authorities arrested hundreds of Templars simultaneously across the country. The torture that followed was methodical and brutal. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master, had his feet roasted over a fire so slowly that the bones in his toes eventually fell out. Other Templars were subjected to the strappado, had their teeth pulled out one by one, or were stretched on the rack until their joints separated. Of the 138 Templars tortured in Paris, 36 died from their injuries. What's particularly disturbing is that we have detailed records of these torture sessions, because the Church kept meticulous notes. They wanted to document every confession and every admission of guilt. Geoffrey de Charny, the Templar preceptor of Normandy, confessed under torture to worshipping idols and spitting on the cross, but later recanted his confession. He was burned at the stake alongside Jacques de Molay in 1314. The case of Gilles de Rais in 1440 shows how torture was used even against the nobility when the charges were serious enough. De Rais, who had fought alongside Joan of Arc, was accused of practicing black magic and murdering hundreds of children. His torture was carried out in his own castle, turned into a makeshift court. Under torture, he confessed to killing over 140 children in satanic rituals. Whether these confessions were true or simply the result of unbearable pain remains debated by historians, but his case established precedents for trying nobles for occult crimes. One of the most documented torture cases involved the Cathars, a Christian sect in southern France that the Catholic Church declared heretical. The Albigensian Crusade, which lasted from 1209 to 1229, wasn't just military warfare. It included systematic torture of captured Cathars to force conversions. In 1244, the fortress of Montségur fell after a 10-month siege. Over 200 perfect Cathar clergy were given the choice: renounce their faith or be burned alive. All 200 chose death. But before the mass execution, many were tortured to reveal the locations of hidden Cathar texts and treasure. Inquisition records describe how hot irons were applied to their feet and hands, and how some had their tongues cut out to prevent them from preaching their heretical beliefs even under torture. The case of William Sauter in 1401 marked the first execution for heresy in England, but his torture beforehand set a precedent for how English authorities would handle religious dissidents. Sauter, a priest who had converted to Lollard beliefs, was tortured in the Tower of London. Records show that his fingernails were pulled out and hot coals were applied to his feet. Despite this, he refused to recant his beliefs and was burned at the stake. Perhaps one of the most tragic cases involves the persecution of Jewish communities during the Black Death pandemic of 1347 to 1351. As the plague ravaged Europe, Jews were blamed for poisoning wells and causing the disease. In Strasbourg in 1349, over 2,000 Jews were tortured to extract confessions of well poisoning. The confessions obtained under torture were then used as evidence to justify the massacre of entire Jewish communities across the region. One specific case that was documented in detail involved a Jewish physician named Isaac ben Abraham in Basel. Under torture, he confessed to receiving poison from Jewish leaders in other cities and distributing it in Christian wells. His confession, obtained through having his legs slowly crushed in a vice, was used to justify the execution of Jewish communities in over a dozen cities along the Rhine. The Spanish Inquisition provides us with perhaps the most detailed records of medieval torture, because they were obsessive record keepers. Take the case of Elvira del Campo in 1567 to 1568. She was a converso, converted Jew, accused of secretly practicing Judaism. Her torture sessions were recorded in minute detail by a court scribe. Del Campo was subjected to the garrucha, Spanish version of the strapado, 3 separate times. During the first session, she was hoisted by her arms tied behind her back and dropped suddenly, dislocating both shoulders. When this didn't produce a confession, weights were added to her feet and the process was repeated. The court records show that she screamed, "I don't know what you want me to say. I have told the truth." But her torturers weren't satisfied. In her second torture session, she was subjected to the toka, water torture. A cloth was placed over her face, and water was slowly poured over it, creating the sensation of drowning. The records note that she appeared to be dying several times but was revived to continue the session. Finally, during her third torture session, she confessed to practicing Jewish rituals in secret. However, historians who have studied her case believe her confessions were false, created simply to end the unbearable pain. Even children weren't spared from medieval torture. In 1475, in the Italian city of Trent, a 2-year-old boy named Simonino went missing. The Jewish community was immediately suspected of ritual murder, a common anti-Semitic accusation known as blood libel. 15 Jews were arrested, including several children. Among the tortured was an 8-year-old boy whose father was accused of participating in the alleged ritual murder. Medieval law technically prohibited torturing children under the age of 14, but exceptions were made for serious crimes like murder or